Et Spiritus Sanctum in vini Sancti Spiritus repetuorum corda fidelium et tuum orisine signum accende, imite Spiritum tuum et creabuntur. Oremus Deus qui corda fidelium Sancti Spiritus illustratione locuisti, dada missiniorum Spiritu recta sapere et de eius semper consolatione godere per Christum Dominum nostrum.
Amen.
Sede sapientiae.
Ora pro nobis.
In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Right. So today we're continuing on with the pontificate of Saint Anastasius II. So when we were talking about the fact that the Franks under Clovis are dominating the former Roman province of Gaul. France, the nation of France, is on the verge of coming into existence at this point. But it has not quite yet, because that is considered to have occurred with the baptism of Clovis, who at this point has not yet been baptized. So at this point, Saint Remigius, or as the French call him, Saint Remy, Saint Remigius in Latin, Saint Remigius, was informed of the fact that there was, remember this, it seems it says a sacred vessel, doesn't specify of what kind of unusual size or beauty, but a chalice or a ciborium. I seem to, I've heard this story before, and the way it was told, I seem to remember a chalice being mentioned, but I'm not sure about that. In any case, a sacred vessel of unusual size and beauty was amongst the loot that Franks had taken at some point from the city of Reims, or that's what we call in English, Reims, of Douay Reims fame, which, as we mentioned before, is also called the best English translation of sacred scripture. The one definitely to use, the one which actually in the rules of our institute, it's the only one that we're to use when as consulting any English translation of sacred scripture. That even if there are others that might not be worthy of being condemned, there is no translation that is better than that, certainly. So the Douay Reims is the one to use. It's called the Douay Reims because part of the translation was done in Reims, where the English college was at the time. So English priests were being trained to be sent back to England to function undercover, which is what they would then do for a year or two at the most, from most of the accounts I'm familiar with, before being betrayed and then killed. So it was an unpleasant thing, but it's interesting. Even to this day, you can continue to discover what are known as priest holes throughout England. They're very common places, even public buildings in some cases. They'll find places where priests could hide from, so they might be staying. They might be staying someplace with people who are secretly Catholics, and who, when the Elizabethan police would come along, they would get an alert, and then they could go and hide somewhere. I may have told the story, but there's actually a big house in Virginia that was transported across the ocean in the 1930s, I believe it was. It was taken apart. It was an old historical house that everybody wanted to preserve, but the place where it had been built in England was collapsing. It was in danger of collapsing because of mining operations in the particular place in which it was in England. And so there was a big debate among British politicians of the time. I think, actually, of all people, Winston Churchill was in favor of its being moved, for whatever that's worth. Anyway, it was purchased by this very wealthy couple in Virginia, and they had it transported across the ocean piece by piece and rebuilt in Virginia. So, and you can see in that house to this day, you can take a tour of it. Now it's a museum, but you can take a tour of it, and you can see the priest hole that's in it. It's in the most unassuming part of the building. It's in the servants' quarters. The building, generally speaking, it's very ornate, certainly for the type of building that it is. It's got all this fancy detail work and all of these panelings and everything, but it's in where the priest hole is in the servants' quarters, the last place anybody would think of visiting in that house. And it looks it's in the most unassuming part of the building. It's just a series of shelves, just a few very simple shelves, and makes the bookshelves here look fancy. Just a few very simple shelves on the wall. Like, oh, it just looks like some ordinary shelves, but you can actually push back the wooden panel that's behind it, and that's large enough to crawl through. There's enough space in between the shelves that a grown man could crawl through it if need be, and hide in there. And wouldn't call it a comfortable space, but definitely large enough that you could wait out several hours if the police really had their sights on the house and really rifled through everything for hours. You could, if they didn't think to look there, you could pass hours in that spot. So, okay. All that because we mentioned the city of Rheims. Amongst the articles from the loot taken from the city of Rheims was a sacred vessel of unusual size and beauty. St. Remigius was informed of the fact and sent to Clovis to claim the prize, so he's hoping to regain it. And Clovis is, while not yet a Catholic, he is definitely sympathetic to the church. So keep that in mind, because somebody, even a civil ruler, may not be a Catholic. It does not mean that necessarily hates Catholics or hates the faith, hates the church. Even in the cases of those who unfortunately never convert, they don't necessarily have it out for the church, as they say. They are not necessarily consumed with hostility against the church. There are multiple examples of that, even from the times in which the English government was persecuting the church. Some of the English colonies, which later on became the 13 original states of the United States, some of those were set up to be safe havens for Catholics. So Maryland, for example, was one of those. That was specifically set up to be a safe haven for Catholics. Lord Baltimore was very sympathetic towards. I think he was actually a Catholic himself. I can't recall at this moment though, but he was. I tend to get him confused with William Penn, for whom Pennsylvania is named, and William Penn was a Quaker, and definitely not a Catholic, but Quakers like to be nice with everybody, so they that's part. I think they're pacifists. Maybe I'm not getting that confused with the Amish or Amish. But in any case, Pennsylvania was another, as an English colony, which that's how long Pennsylvania has been settled and civilized since before the American Revolution. It was another place that was not set up specifically to be a safe haven for Catholics, but Catholics could, generally speaking, live in Pennsylvania when it was an English colony without any trouble. Whereas Virginia, as a colony, Virginia was a place where that was bad for persecution. And there are even, I think to this day, some laws that are still on the books that were designed. Those laws are still there. I don't know how they're enforced at all. But there are still some laws that are on the books, at least that were on the books in the early years of the traditional movement, that are designed to make it difficult for Catholics to get married in Virginia. So it doesn't seem to cause much difficulty anymore for Catholics to get married. I've not heard of that being any problem in recent decades, but the fact of the matter is there are still some traces of that, of the persecution in the English colonies. So anyway, just because someone's not a Catholic doesn't mean he has that out for the church. So definitely William Penn did not. And Quakers, generally speaking, are nice to everybody. That's there in theory anyway. So the precious article was soon found amid the spoils heaped up under a tent in the public square. And so Dallas likes to narrate in detail, make as dramatic as possible anecdotes like this. But long story short, Clovis tries to get all of his men to agree to this, with the idea that we'll return this treasure in the event that everybody agrees to return it. But one soldier, whom Darius described as rude and jealous, which it seems he was, said, "You shall have this cup only when it is yours by lot," and took his battle axe and destroyed the sacred vessel. So that was not exactly a pious thing to do. Clovis silently gathered up the fragments and gave them to the messengers of St. Remigius. So we have to have a footnote here, such as the account of contemporary writers, some modern authors, in order to show the perfect equality, that's the idea, to show perfect equality between chief and subordinates, have distorted the account in order to oppress their own view upon the reader, and have passed over the chief incident, which is the restoration of the vessel, though in fragments to the deputies of St. Remigius. So Clovis, even though it seemed he was not going to violate the usual way of doing things among Franks, that's how they would divide their spoils. If somebody wanted something, they would have to cast lots or whatnot to decide who got what. If you got what you wanted, then great. But in this case, that didn't happen, so he decided to abide by that, but didn't expect that the man would destroy it, but who did, in fact, So anyway, that was not good, but he still did what he could to return it. A year had passed since this event. The king was one day from receiving the Franks in a field of Mars, a yearly gathering of the warriors. So field of Mars, that refers to the mythological god of war. When he recognized the soldier whose rude audacity had appealed to the right of division. Your arms, said the king to him, are in the worst condition of any that I have seen in the army. Your mace, your sword, and your battle axe all show your slovenly carelessness. And snatching away his axe, Clovis threw it upon the ground. The soldier stooped to pick it up, but the king, suddenly lifting up his own, clove into the trooper's skull. So, as what he had done, he says, so you did to the cup at Soissons. So, hard to see how that could be justified, but we are still dealing with a pagan ruler here, and old habits die hard. So there was, he definitely, that was he did that to show his disapproval of what that soldier had done. That seems to be a little much, but you have to understand, not by way of justifying, but to keep in mind the big picture. This was probably a pretty common thing. The king was not happy with how one of his soldiers, with the state of the gear of one of his soldiers. Killing him was not, among pagans, as not outside the realm of possibility. Keep in mind the Romans, who were amongst the pagan, we're talking about the pagan Romans before the conversion of the empire, they were amongst the most civilized of the pagan civilizations of the ancient world, that they had this practice if a legion showed cowardice in battle, if they retreated or for any reason they were considered to have shown cowardice, they would do what they called decimating the ranks of that legion, which is a word that has come down to us today to mean just that something is destroyed. It's decimated. I mean, it's usually something obliterated and decimated are practically synonymous terms. They're very close in meaning anyway. But decimating, that term originally came from the practice of killing every 10th soldier. They would cast lots, every 10th soldier would die in punishment for the cowardice of the legion. So there might conceivably be reason to discipline a military unit that has not functioned according to the standards of the army of which they are part, but to do that is excessive. The point being that this sort of thing is not uncommon. That killing, let's say that there was little sense of any value of human life in the ancient pagan world. There was little respect for immortal souls, most of which is the main thing. Little respect for the fifth commandment, which of course they did think of as being the fifth commandment. They did not have divine revelation, not to the extent that we have it now, of course. The effects of original sin were pretty much just completely out of control. So the bloody execution performed by the hand of the king himself seems repugnant to our day and custom. Then it was deemed severe and was more powerful than laws to teach the victors that they should spare the vanquished. So even then it was perhaps considered severe, perhaps hard to see how that could be justified, but in any case, St. Remigius entertained a strong hope of implanting the true faith in the heart of a prince whose power kept pace with his renown and who was evidently destined to rule the whole of Gaul. So I get, coming from Darras, something you'd be inclined to take with a grain of salt, but in this case he was actually right, that Clovis did end up ruling, the Gaul, or what became France here shortly after this, did not always have the same borders that it has now. The Kingdom of France has taken various shapes over time. What territory is actually ruled from Paris, or whatever capital it is that the ruler of France has chosen, which is usually Paris. But in any case, it's not the same size as it is today. Definitely not. France is, compared to, say, for example, what was in the Middle Ages, certainly during the 100 Years' War, the English controlled about half of France. And what was the other half was lesser than what is half of France today. So it's the borders are different now than what they were then. Even so, yes, Clovis did, as he's generally considered to have been the first king of France. So he deemed that this could be best brought about by giving to Clovis a Christian wife. He therefore effected for him an alliance with a princess as distinguished for virtue as for nobility of birth, one whose memory, perpetuated by the Church in the calendar of the saints, is imperishably dear to every French heart. And, well, that comes as no surprise, that last statement. So Clotilda was the niece of Gundebald, king of the Burgundians. So that's a good tribal name for you there, Gundebald. Imagine naming your kid Gundebald, or advising someone else to name his child Gundebald. That would be interesting. What do you call that? What do you call it? Baldy? I don't know. Certainly no better than gun. So. Anyway, niece of Clotilda, that's reasonable. But Gundebald. Anyway, there are plenty other much more outlandish barbarian names than that. That's fairly tame in comparison. We may or may not see those. It's always amusing when they come up. But it sounds you might find those names actually if you look up books of casuistry, moral theology cases, difficult moral theology cases that were questions that maybe somebody had to ask about to resolve how to resolve this situation. It's an unusual, very complicated situation. You need to how to distinguish all the elements and ascertain all the principles to be applied in this case. It had to be asked anonymously, so sometimes you would take these names from history books, all these crazy names, and substitute this in place of the real names, so it would remain all anonymous, while still making clear the number of characters involved in the situation. So, brought up in an Arian court under the eye of an uncle. Notice that the Burgundians are apparently Arians. They're not pagans, they're heretics. Brought up in an Arian court under the eye of an uncle who had murdered her father and mother to gain possession of their wealth, she was still a Catholic, and the holiness of her life corresponded to the purity of her faith. So that's also typical of barbarians, just killing off family members to gain power. But that's also typical of barbarians and also of the Eastern Roman Empire, of the Byzantine Empire, the Greek Empire after a while, which was, that's the fact of the matter is it's pretty barbarous, in fact. So the fact that they claim to be the second Rome does not change the fact that they behaved pretty barbarously long after Rome itself had ceased to be home to that sort of thing. As Queen of the Franks, her virtue and her charms won her husband's heart. She made use of his perfect confidence in her, only to draw him gradually out of the darkness of heathenism. So this can happen many times. Well, it's actually St. Francis de Sales says that it's actually an effective original sin that women seek to influence men and that men allow themselves to be influenced by women. So that, generally speaking, it's a bad thing. Many times, anyway, that's a bad thing, that a man should allow himself to be influenced by a woman. But that sometimes can work towards the good. For example, yes, if the woman is the one who is strong in the faith, she might be able to bring her husband around to it. And that can happen. That's not by any means unheard of. But that's also not to say that anybody should enter into marriage. This is an exceptional case here. Here we have the case of the king of the Franks, and St. Remigius seeking to bring about the conversion of the king of the Franks, which he already has a hope of doing. So this really is an exceptional case, but people should not, that's an important thing, people should not enter into a marriage to all bring this person around when there's no basis for hoping for that. And even if it does happen, there is doubt there as to the sincerity of, and we could say the sincerity, certainly the depth of the conversion. If the person, okay, fine, I'll get married so we can get married. We can have a full wedding in a Catholic church. But they might not. They might even outwardly practice the faith. They might even profess the faith, might say all the right things, do all the right things as far as can be ascertained. But even so, there's always some question as to the depth of that. It's not to say that it could never become sincere if it wasn't sincere to begin with, or that the conversion could never be deepened, but there's always a question mark over it when that's the case. So this is why people should just be encouraged. Just marry Catholics. I mean, sometimes it could happen that a Novosordite, for example, has to undergo a conversion, but maybe was never enthusiastic about the faith, what he thought was the faith, because he didn't realize that what the Catholic faith actually is. And that can happen. Sometimes people, once they wake up and they realize, okay, there actually is a Catholic faith, and this is actually something I could see why this is actually something to be enthusiastic about that can lead to a conversion of sorts, but not in the sense of getting someone to join the Catholic Church purely on the occasion of getting married. Sometimes it might go hand in hand. Someone might be in the process of converting and meet someone who is already a Catholic. That's a different story. But the point is, it's best to encourage people to marry other traditional Catholics who are clearly fervent traditional Catholics. It doesn't have to say you have to go only for someone you think is a saint. That's not something that, that wouldn't be a bad thing. It's because, well, as a general principle also, it's better that people not get married at all than that they marry badly. That's for sure. Better to go through life celibate and perhaps never having given up the right to marry, as in the case of entering the priesthood or the religious life. But it definitely, well, in the case of nowadays religious life, even so, the vow of chastity is really a private vow. But in a practical sense, certainly giving up the right to marry. Even if that's not the case, it's better for people to go through life unmarried, living by themselves, than to be married to someone that they then wish they had not married. Because that's a completely different thing than, say, maybe entering into a situation of an apostolate with a priest that you end up not getting along with. Because you can part ways, and that's that. Whereas a marriage that's a whole nother thing. That is, that's a commitment for life, obviously, which is something that they know entering into, and that actually, when you give marriage instruction, you have to make that clear. That they have to swear that they understand that this marriage bond that they're going to forge, it cannot be broken by anything other than death. You have to swear that they understand that. And so there's a whole list of questions that they answer under oath before you even begin marriage instruction. And that's one of the things they have to swear that they clearly understand. So they can say, oh, I didn't realize that. No. Here's the day in which you answer these questions under oath. Here are the answers you gave the priest who asked them to you, and he signed the sheet of paper after you asked him these questions under oath. And so that's cannot claim ignorance on that. This was all clearly explained to you. So this is something of an exceptional case, definitely, and there might be exceptional reasons to grant such things, grant dispensation. Of course, now according to the common discipline, the current discipline of the Church, according to canon law currently, for a Catholic to try to marry an unbaptized person is an invalid marriage. It's called disparity of worship or disparity of cult, in Latin disparitas cultus. That is, it's an impediment of ecclesiastical law. Now, there's no divine law invalidating such a marriage, an attempted marriage, but it is an ecclesiastical impediment. So somebody who attempts to marry a baptized Catholic, either someone who was baptized a Catholic and left the church, or someone who was baptized perhaps outside the church but validly has entered into the church, or even if that person leaves afterwards, that person attempting to marry an unbaptized person, that's an invalid marriage without a dispensation. Unless there is a dispensation, that's an invalid marriage. And also that keep in mind that anybody who's legally, we'll say, let's keep it simple, legally considered baptized is subject to the laws of the church. So that means the Greek and Russian schismatics are subject to the laws of the church, as are all Protestants who may have been validly baptized and so forth. They're all subject to the laws of the church. So the Greek and Russian schismatics, if they attempt to marry someone who is unbaptized, that's also an invalid marriage by law of the church. Whereas if a Protestant, perhaps a validly baptized Protestant, or a Protestant anyway who qualifies as legally baptized, tries to marry an unbaptized person, then that's a valid marriage by law of the church. The church controls all of that. But also the laws of the church are very clearly and very carefully designed so as not to lead anybody into sin. So in other words, clearly the Eastern schismatics the church deems are more likely to pay attention to the laws of the church than heretics are. Schismatics have become heretics too, but it's a result of their schism rather than they're not in a sense primarily heretics. They're primarily schismatics. And when, say, Greek or Russian schismatics return to the church, any heresies they might have adopted, they usually give those up as part of giving up their schism. Whereas for Protestants, for example, they are in schism in the sense that they claim to be Christians, but are in habitual defiance of the Holy See. They qualify as schismatics in that respect, but they're not usually characterized as that, because first thing they do is they're famous. What are they famous for? Rejecting a huge portion of divine revelation, which is why they're heretics. Now, they completely throw out everything contained in divine tradition, and even those things contained in sacred scripture. They corrupted versions of those ideas, of those truths. So, okay. So in this case, you don't have to look at what the discipline of the church was at this time, but in any case, at the very least, there was a dispensation granted if that was necessary for this marriage. And we'll see that St. Remigius was quite correct in his assessment. He seemed already on the point of yielding to her wishes when an unfortunate event turned him suddenly back. Their firstborn son, baptized under the name of Ingomar, died whilst yet in his baptismal robe. So Ingomar, that's another good one. Not too outlandish, but definitely not a name you'd expect to hear nowadays. Clovis harshly reproached Clotilda and said, had the child been consecrated to my gods, he had not died. Which is false, obviously. But there's no guarantee that had he not been baptized, he would not have died. Even setting aside the notion of idolatrously, if that's a word, consecrating in an idolatrous manner the child to pagan gods, even abstracting, even putting aside that idea, there's no guarantee if he'd not been baptized, he would not have died. And of course, the fact that he was baptized validly and then died, that means he's a saint. So we know that this child is in fact a saint. So he was, however, appeased and allowed his second son to be carried to the baptismal font and baptized under the name of Clodomir. So he is not baptized himself yet, but he is allowing his children to be baptized at this point. And that's another condition of a marriage between a Catholic and a non-Catholic, whether it be dispensation being granted in the case of disparity of worship, or a case of a mixed marriage, as it's called, which is a marriage between a baptized Catholic and a baptized non-Catholic. So a non-Catholic who at least legally qualifies as being baptized. That still requires a dispensation, but it's considered a lesser impediment than the disparity of worship. Because some impediments make attempted marriage invalid. Others make it illicit, a grave sin to contract, but still the contract is made. So in the case of a cleric who has received major orders, unless he has been given back the right to marry by the authority of the church, that's an attempt is invalid, no question. Or someone under solemn religious vows, that's invalid. And not solemn, not to be used with simple religious vows. Simple religious vows, as I recall those, make the attempted marriage illicit, gravely sinful to contract, but still is considered valid. So, okay. So the illness of his child threw Clotilda into a state of harrowing anguish, or Clovis, their child, threw Clotilda into a state of harrowing anguish. Clovis already accused her of causing the death of both children. Clodomir, however, recovered, but Clovis was still distrustful. So clearly his conversion is not complete if he's thinking that that's a result of receiving the sacraments that his children, the first one died, the second one is perhaps in danger of death, or was in danger of death. But keep in mind also, at this time, infant mortality rate was quite high. And in the past, that's throughout the history of the world, it's a relatively recent thing that, at least in first world countries, that babies usually live. And there are tragic cases that miscarriages still happen, obviously, and babies born prematurely can still die. Technology is not so far advanced that it can save any baby born at any premature period. But in most days you expect that the child will survive. Then childbirth and infancy will go well. You expect that, generally speaking. In the past, that was not the case. I mean, you would hear about, I think it was Saint Catherine of Siena. She was youngest or second youngest of a huge family. I think it was well over 10 children. I can't remember exactly how many, but those were half the children that survived. Her parents had twice as many, but half of them didn't survive infancy. So yeah, that was fairly normal in the past. Half the babies born in a family might die, and even the ones that survived infancy, they might die as young children. You never know. You never knew. In the past, hold on life was a much more tenuous thing than it is now, generally speaking. So keep in mind, and especially at this time, and if you were to see that nowadays, you might think, okay, this is something unusual going on, but at the time, not really. So it was necessary that a conversion fraught with consequences so important should be effected in such a manner as to convince the world that it was the work of heaven, of the power of the Most High, which of course every conversion is. It's a working of grace. But this was meant to be like divine providence clearly willed that this be done in a very, most definitely conspicuous manner, highly conspicuous manner. So several bodies of Suevi or Alemanni, so other tribes, crossed the Rhine at Cologne in 496 and invaded the dominions of Sigebert, chief of the Ripuarii. So you have all these different tribes still around. There's quite a bit of movement of tribes moving around, conquering formerly Roman territories, and forging the nations of Western Europe that we know now. So all of that is still very much in development. So keep in mind, for example, the Saxons, as in the Saxons who were ruling England at the time of England itself is for the tribe of the Angles, named for the tribe of the Angles or Angles, who had clearly overtaken the ancient Britons, who were related to the ancient Gauls, who lived in the in the Roman province of Gaul when the Romans came in there and conquered it. So the Angles had taken over from the ancient Britons, whom the Romans called the island Britannia to begin with, and then the Saxons, a Germanic tribe, conquered England. So then you have what's called Anglo-Saxon England, and then the Normans, who had been Norsemen, had been Vikings, but who had become Frenchmen, then conquered England to form over time that all just became the English people. And you could see to this day, actually, you could even see in the town names in England, you can see roughly where all these different people settled. That you can see Norse roots in names and towns in certain places, and so on and so forth. It's a complicated thing. Right? The island has obviously a very long history, but just looking at just at England, which is relatively limited patch of territory, you can see all that influence. Just looking at maps of England. So it's a large island, but it's got one that's clearly very, very rich in history, and you can find all kinds of interesting things to study about it. That's everywhere in Western Europe, but just taking that as an example. Okay, so the two armies met near Tolbiac, the present Tulpik, in the Duchy of Juliers. Both nations were equally brave, equally jealous of their glory and their freedom. The shock of battle was fearful. Sigebert was wounded, and Sigebert, I'm not sure exactly how they pronounce that, and his troops were thrown into a state of disorder. The panic was rapidly spreading among the ranks when Clovis, seeing the desperate state of his cause, cried aloud, "God, whom Clotilda worships, I have no refuge but thee. Come to my help, and I will believe in thee. I will be baptized in thy name." So this vow, uttered in a loud voice, rallied his scattered warriors about him. Clovis himself felt a new courage within his bosom, and cheering on his Franks, rushed with headlong daring upon the enemy. The consternation and terror the Burgundians had caused now returned to their own rank, and their king remained upon the field amid the flower of his army. So they won the battle, in essence. And notice that the Burgundians are clearly an entirely separate tribe from the Franks, and even after they became, in later centuries, much more civilized than simply a barbarian tribe, which is they're a little more than that at this point. That even so, the Duchy of Burgundy, the people who lived there, still called the Burgundians. They were practically independent, or practically an independent duchy. Keep that in mind, that we think now of the way that nations are run, everything is very centralized for the most part. modern day presidents, to put it simply, have much greater power than medieval kings had in practice. Whatever the theory was, today's presidents can control their own territories much more directly and much more thoroughly than medieval kings could. Because, just for one thing, consider the speed of communications. Nowadays, you can pretty much, if you have internet access, you can communicate with anybody anywhere else in the world at practically an instant's notice, as long as that other person has internet access, for very little to no cost beyond what it takes to acquire that internet access to begin with, which is just absolutely incredible. I mean, for practically instant communications to most other places in the world with certain access to technology has been more or less possible for a while now, but I mean, the internet has just made it that much easier, even more accessible. In the past, yes, phones have been around for a long time, but used to be extremely expensive to call someone on the phone in another country, or even just to speak with someone else on the phone for a long time. It used to cost a lot of money. Now you can do that over the internet for pretty much anywhere else in the world, to any other place that has internet access for little to no extra cost beyond what you're already paying. So that is incredible, and that's part of what makes governing places so much easier. Why it makes it possible to regulate things. Nowadays, yes, you can set up cameras everywhere and spy on everybody all the time, pretty much, and see whether they're observing the laws, perhaps the very oppressive laws that you're putting out. Think of China, communist China. It's famous for being surveillance everywhere. And if we're just talking about England, you go to the UK, there are cameras everywhere there too. It's something that might not be immediately obvious, but actually, the UK has been socialistic for a long time. England was actually, even before the Bolsheviks, before the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, before the communists took over Russia, their first target was actually England. They wanted to forge England into a communist nation. And that didn't work out, at least not to the extent that they wanted it to. It was just heavily socialized, clearly, even in the early 20th century. There were attempts to, for example, the socialists in England tried to assassinate Prime Minister David Lloyd George during the First World War. Because I guess he wasn't leftist enough for them. So they decided they tried to bomb his car at least once, I think it was. They tried to kill him. I forget the exact circumstances. They tried killing him with bombs at one point. Didn't work, but they tried it. He was, David Lloyd George was one of those prominent characters at the Treaty of Versailles. He was, I think, as I recall, I'd have to review the details, but I think he was one of the voices who tried to exercise some moderation. That it was Georges Clemenceau who was one of those, used civilized language to describe him as low character French Third Republic politicians, who said he wanted to be, when he died, he said he wanted to be buried standing up facing Germany. Such was his hatred of Germany, and just a vicious character. And I think it was to him. Yes, there's a saying. The French have the saying that the United States is a nation that passed from barbarism to decadence without passing through civilization. That's how they think of the United States. They'll say anything nasty about us. Never mind the fact they saved them from Germany twice. Don't worry too much about that. But the point is, that's how they think of. They don't like the U.S. Generally speaking, as a nation, they cannot stand the U.S. or really anybody else who might be seen to be rival, even just a rival with France. Certainly not a nation that has surpassed them the way that the United States has. But in any case, it was he who said that. Well, he would know a thing or two about being barbarous. That's for sure. Clemenceau. And one of the, he was the one who really was pushing for the punishment of Germany at the Versailles Treaty. So, in any case, all that, because we started with the Burgundians, somehow got to that from the Burgundians. The Burgundians will remain effectively independent for a long time, even during the 100 Years' Wars. Actually, of course, the English ended up putting Saint Joan of Arc to death during the 100 Years' War, but it was actually the Burgundians who initially captured her. They were allied with the English. They captured her and they handed her over to the English instead of giving her back to the king, whom she had helped put on the throne. Another very weak character was the King Charles, whom she put on the throne. So it helped him to get there. So the Burgundians. On his return to his own domain after this victory, Clovis put himself under the direction of St. Remigius and St. Vedastus, the holy priest from the neighborhood of Toul. One day, the holy bishop of Reims was reading to him the Passion of Jesus Christ, and Clovis, filled with the indignation of a soldier, exclaimed, "Oh, that I had been there with my Franks." So he got angry at the injustice that was clearly at play in the putting to death of our Lord, which definitely it was, there's no question of that. It is infuriating to read the details of that to this day. So on another occasion, he said to Saint Remigius, "I would willingly go on listening to you, but I foresee an obstacle. My people will not give up their present belief, but I will go and speak to them as you advise." So, general, long story short, Darras likes to go into the details a little more than is necessary, sometimes much more than is necessary. But the point is, he got his people to give up paganism, to give up heathenism, forsaking mortal gods, as he said. False, of course, understanding they're false gods if they're mortal. And we wish for no other than the immortal God of Remigius. So the bishop joyfully made preparations for the baptism of the king and the Franks, and assisted by Saint Vedastus, continued to instruct and to prepare them according to the canons, fasting, penance, and prayer. So this was a common thing. This was an understanding at the time, very natural. It was considered to be a very natural result that whatever religion was held by this could be correctly applied well or applied badly, but there was definitely an understanding at the time that obviously you have the same religion as your head of state, as far as possible. There was a sense of that. It's applied well if that ruler has the faith, but of course loyalty to the faith and the necessity of belonging to the church, that supersedes any such consideration. But there was, in other words, a very clear understanding that church and state must be united. Now they understood that on some level. It was just common sense, really. If you don't have, they understood, at least instinctively, that if you don't have religious unity, you will never have national unity. Impossible. Those are the most important things, clearly. Everybody realizes that. Throughout time, till the period of the Enlightenment, everybody realized that religious truths are the most important truths on which to be in agreement. And with agreement as to foreign policy or how to maintain public infrastructure or defense of a nation, all of that stuff, that's all all important, no doubt, but all secondary, very secondary, compared to the most important truths, which are religious truths. If you don't agree on those most important truths, what does agreement on anything else? What will that ever get you? So the baptismal fonts of St. Martin's, the great church of Reims, were magnificently adorned. The nave was decorated with white hangings. The same emblematic color also appeared in the dress of Clovis and the other catechumens chosen from among the flower of the Salians. So these white, yes, indeed, was the revolutionary combination of the colors red, white, and blue, which was adopted by the French during the Revolution. Those were colors that were put together. They had used those colors traditionally for a long time, but not like that, not in the tricolor form that symbolizes the Revolution. But actually, it was interesting. It was an interesting. I don't know if it made major headlines, but a few years ago, the French they changed the color of the blue. I think back to a darker blue. It had been the original revolutionary version was this darker blue than what was the case was actually on the French flag for a long time. But a few years ago, I think it was done fairly quietly. But Macron changed it back to the darker blue, just showing that he is a leftist. He is definitely a leftist. He is. No, there's no question of that. I remember years ago when he was first elected, I'm following out a little bit. No, I don't follow French politics much, but I remember that, and a new president coming in is a big deal. So I remember following that a bit. And I remember seeing that all of the other, he was clearly the front runner for all of the leftists. But it was interesting because he was technically running, I think as an independent. I think he's not technically part of a socialist party. Keep in mind, in this country we have two parties, and that's about it. Yeah, technically there might be others, but effectively two parties. Everybody is aligned with one or the other, whether or not officially a member of it aligned with one or the other. Whereas in Europe, that's not the case. You can have a multitude of political parties. And that's why there's such an emphasis on forming a coalition government, because the fact of the matter is there's so many parties that no one party has enough people to get elected to rule the government. So nowadays you think of the government as Republican or Democrat in this country. meaning that yes, there are still obviously still opposition members in Congress, but it's either run by one or the other party. Whereas in Europe, they have to make agreements. The whole thing works quite differently in Europe. Even though they do have elections and things like that, they definitely look to the United States. What happens in the U.S. definitely influences what happens there, but the system is, on the level of theory, quite different, which results in also in practice that they do things somewhat differently. So they have to make deals with other members of other parties to form a government that works, a coalition. So sometimes it talks about, the way this election turned out, it's unclear as to whether the chancellor or whoever, or the prime minister, will be able to form an effective coalition, to form, in other words, the moral person that actually rules the country. So things work a bit differently there. So we got into that because of the color white. Yes, white has long been in use as a color, as a symbol of France, but the combination with red and blue, that's all. That's a revolution. That's a product of the revolution. So white was the color of the French kings for a long time, precisely because it was started with Clovis. It seems eventually they added the fleur de lis, which, if I recall correctly, the French actually pronounce the S at the end of that. Fleur de lis. They say fleur de lis. Yeah, if there's one letter in French pronunciation that can be considered a wild card letter, it's S. You never know. If it comes at the end of a word, you never know. You might as well flip a coin to try to figure out whether you pronounce it or not. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. So just have to know. Have to find out from someone who already knows whether not to pronounce it. So they say fleur de lis, so for whatever reason it came over to English as fleur de lis. So the flag of France for a long time was that. At least I think of France, the national flag for a long time was the fleur de lis, as we call it in English, on a white background. And actually, at a certain point after the fall of Napoleon III, who was a revolutionary, he was a monarch, but he was a revolutionary, there was a hope of restarting a Catholic monarchy in France in the late 19th century. And there were multiple different claimants to the throne, and one of whom was I believe it was the Count de Chambord. He was the one he probably could have become king of France, but one of the other claimants said, well, I'll cede my claim to yours if you adopt the tricolor. And he said, I will never do that, to his credit. He was absolutely unwilling to adopt as his flag the symbol of the revolution. And so France never got a king. They ended up forming the Third Republic instead, which went very sour very quickly. But that was all they could manage at that point as well. And we would like to have a king. Napoleon's out. There's no question of restarting the empire. The Bonapartists are done. That's ended. We'd like to start. France is very strongly monarchical. As to say, they very definitely rally around a king with the title of king. Yeah, we've talked about that before. Every nation, in some sense, has a monarch, and it's just a natural tendency in human nature to seek a single ruler and one man. But some nations tend to that more strongly than others, and those are the nations that we characterize as being more strongly monarchical. And France is very strongly monarchical. They very much rally around one ruler, and that's natural. And that's the form of government that's most in accordance with nature. So that's not a bad thing. By any means, just some nations are very strongly that way. Some so strongly that unless they have that strong ruler, they pretty much can't get their act together. Certainly, every nation, the stronger ruler it has, will act in unison better, no doubt. But in this country, it's possible to positively despise the president and still the country can function. Or half the country can despise the president and still things can function on some level. Whereas in other countries, that doesn't work so well. So Russia, for example, it seems they have not really functioned well in a war since they've had a czar. They fought various wars and even won. I mean, they won World War II, and in some sense they won anyway. They took enormous losses. They were on the winning side, we can say. Certainly that. And they contributed their bit for sure, but they've not really had a good day in war since the czars were a thing of the past, became a thing of the past. Now they had, even before the ending of that era, there were many bad days they had, but they seem, Russia, in other words, they're also another very strongly monarchical nation. Just look at the fact Putin is effectively the Tsar of Russia and has been effectively the Tsar of Russia for 25 years now. They first came to power in every sense that matters, he first came into power in the year 2000, or at least the latest anyway, and has been in power since then. And sometimes as president, sometimes as prime minister, but he's been pulling the strings constantly for a good quarter of a century now. So he's effectively the Tsar of Russia. So the Russians, the point is, are another nation that's very strongly monarchical. And it seems they need, in order to get their act together, they need somebody who is a strong ruler and who's also highly competent. And they've been short on those for a long time. So that's how it seems. All right, so we'll continue with this next time. Spiritus Sancti sub tuum presidium confugimus sancta Dei genitrix, nostras efficationes et specias in necessitatibus, sera periculis concutis liberanos semper virgo gloriosa verdicta. Amen. In Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen.